Hello everyone, and welcome back to the final episode of the second run of the Color Spotlight series. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at a highly requested and often underappreciated or misunderstood pigment in watercolors, the opaque versions of PR101. The pigment PR101 is highly versatile, and depending on how it's processed, it can result in an extremely wide range of hues and opacities ranging from a translucent burnt orange to a deep opaque earthy violet color. Originally, when I asked my patrons what color they'd like to see, I listed this possible episode as Venetian Red. However, in my head, I was making a bit of an error because the color I actually had in mind was the slightly deeper Indian Red. So I thought we'd go ahead and cover them both today, and I'll throw in the final opaque version of PR101, Caput Mortuum, just for good measure. So now that I've confused you by giving you 3 different color names, all matching PR101, let's take a closer look to learn about the similarities that each of these colors share, as well as how they differ from each other. PR101 is a synthetic red iron oxide. It's extremely light fast, fairly staining across the board due to its fine particle size, and usually fairly dull, regardless of which specific hue it is. Also regarding the hue, these opaque PR101s have a massive drying shift when used in watercolor washes, meaning that they lose a ton of saturation and vibrancy as they dry. This can be hard to get used to and disappointing if you're expecting something different, but there are some lovely trade-offs, and I'll touch on that throughout today's episode. This pigment is widely used in a variety of industries, from the pigment that colors bricks and construction to automotive colors and of course artist quality paints. In watercolors, I think a lot of people are put off by this color's opacity, but I actually have learned to love it for that reason. It still tints out to a soft luminous wash when you use a lot of water, but it can also be used in stronger concentrations for some added opacity and some oomph in the final layers of a painting. I keep mentioning that today we are going to be looking at the opaque versions of this pigment, and that is because there are also transparent versions of this color as well. Translucent PR101s are used by some companies like Winsor & Newton for their burnt sienna color, and we're not going to be looking at those today. So diving into a closer look at the opaque varieties of PR101, let's start with the original namesake for this episode, which was Venetian Red. This is a very orange version of this color, being a little lighter and brighter than the rest of the colors we'll see today. Formerly made from natural red iron oxide, Venetian Red is now typically made from PR101 in most commercial lines of paint. Sometimes this same hue will also go by the name of English Red rather than Venetian Red, or even be simply called light red. I realized when pulling samples for this video, I don't actually have many samples. I only have 3, those being from Sennelier, White Nights, and Schmincke. They are very consistent across the board, however, in terms of color payout and opacity. However, holding up to their reputation, Sennelier does indeed have the cleanest glazing out of any version of this color. The PR101 that I have a great deal more of is the color that was in my own head originally when I suggested this episode, and that is a deeper hue most often called Indian Red. Like Venetian Red, it's quite opaque, but this hue usually leans closer to more of a purpley type of undertone rather than the orange. To me, this color just looks so soft. It looks like it would feel like suede or something of the like, and in the last several months, and maybe a little bit more than that, I've really enjoyed adding it to my palette. These swatches are arranged from most orange on the left to the more violet tones on the right. I do have one Venetian Red swatch on this page by Core, but I felt like the hue better matched the Indian Red, so I wanted to go ahead and share it here. However, I will show you all of these swatches side by side in just a few moments. The only other sample that doesn't use the name Indian Red out of the ones that I have is Ingram's Terra Rosa. My favorite versions of this color are the Terra Rosa for its beautiful glazing properties, and Da Vinci's for a really beautiful consistent Indian Red. Finally, we have a very different hue, and it's one that I probably didn't need to include in this color spotlight since the other two are much more similar to each other. However, I know a lot of you have questions about this color, so I thought, hey, we're already doing 2, let's go ahead and add in a third. The final opaque version of PR101 that we're taking a look today is Caput Mortuum, also called Mars Violet or Violet Iron Oxide. Caput Mortuum literally translates to dead head in Latin, but more commonly was used to mean worthless remains in its use in alchemy. It's fairly widespread in our watercolor community that the Caput Mortuum used to be made from mummies. However, I did a little bit of digging and research and I wanted to share what I found. It actually appears that the pigment name was borrowed from the alchemical usage, according to Wikipedia, because iron oxide, or rust as we more commonly know it, is a useless residual oxidation of the process, thus kind of filling that definition of worthless remains that was used in alchemy. Caput Mortuum was then also applied to mummy brown, which was indeed made from mummies during the 16th and 17th centuries. My research found that this color could range anywhere from yellow to red to brown to violet, which I guess is similar to PR101. It is said to have a good transparency, which is different from the colors that we're looking at today, but it also had a tendency to crack. It was understandably unreliable in hue due to its wide range of quality, depending on the source that it came from, and once artists found out that that paint was made from mummies, they pretty much widely stopped asking for it or using it in their works. So while the name Caput Mortuum might have been used to describe that color for mummy brown, the PR101 version does seem to have roots in that alchemy background rather than the mummy one. In any case, it's a gorgeous granulating and opaque color that you'll see me use later on in this video. Here they all are on screen so that you can see the orangey Venetian Reds, the more moderately toned Indian Reds, and the purpley violet iron oxide all together. Due to the complicated nature of this episode and the 3 different hues that I'm looking at today, it would be pretty inconvenient as well as not very informative to watch each entire swatching process on its own. So instead what I did is I took a fair amount of extra time in the editing world to go ahead and clip together rows of these pigments so that we can go ahead and compare them one by one. In the interest of time, I'm going to try and go through them pretty quickly, but you can always pause if you want to take a closer look at each individual swatch. For this entire series of slides, I'm using Sennelier's Venetian Red, Da Vinci's Indian Red, and Winsor & Newton's Caput Mortuum. First, we're going to be taking a look at these 3 colors with Hansa Yellow Deep. The Venetian Red makes a range of absolutely stunning and honestly surprisingly bright oranges in the mass tones, or when they're diluted, they even give way to soft peaches. Given that Indian Red is deeper than the Venetian, we can of course expect to see some more muted oranges in that center row, and finally the violet nature of the Caput Mortuum is very apparent, as in this mixture of colors, they are opposites and they start to neutralize each other, so they're more grayed out. This next slide is kind of an odd duck. Not all 3 colors were the same, and that's just because I changed my mind halfway through, but I had a good reason. Although I wanted to use Perylene Violet upon my initial mixes, I realized that when I mixed it with Venetian Red, I ended up with colors that looked close to Caput Mortuum itself. So I figured if I mixed Perylene Violet with Caput Mortuum, we wouldn't really see much of a range. So for the other 2, I switched to using Quinacridone Magenta to show off a range of really beautiful pinks and muted purples. Next up, we have Dioxygen Violet, which is a cool, deep purple. Across the board, we have a range of dusky purples when combined with any of the PR101s, with the Venetian Red being a little bit more neutralized because of its yellow-orange bias, and the Caput Mortuum remaining more saturated because it already leans towards purple. It was hard to decide which blue to use for this video because my favorite pairing with PR101 is Anthracnone Blue. However, I showed that off in the respective episode that was airing earlier in this series, which I'll link up in the right-hand corner for you if you haven't already seen it. Here I'm using the Phthalo Turquoise, and we do have a huge range of colors, and it really matters in this particular case which PR101 you choose. You'll get green tones with the Venetian Red, again because of that yellow-orange bias, and deep, moody grays and teals with the Caput Mortuum because, again, that violet undertone. PR101 pairs stunningly with Cerulean Blue, which I actually shared in a secret episode of Color Spotlight over on Patreon. It's kind of a long story if you haven't already heard it, but basically the whole collective us over on Patreon couldn't decide between Cerulean and Venetian Red, so I did Cerulean for them, and I chose to put Venetian Red here on the channel since we haven't done anything like it before in the series. In the one over on Patreon, I ended up painting an elephant that used Venetian Red and cerulean blue together, and we got these really dreamy grays, and it was just a pleasure to work with. I'll post a link below this video if you're interested in heading on over to Patreon to check that out, but long story short, I didn't want to use cerulean again, so I've used Cobalt Teal today. It's close enough to cerulean, but a little bit different, a little cooler and greener, so we get a different variety of colors to take a look at. I particularly love it with the Caput Mortuum because of the soft grays it produces. Finally, we have these PR101s mixed with Sodalite Genuine, which is certainly a specialty color, but we're in the final stretch of this whole thing, so why the heck not? These mixtures are really reminiscent of the favorite grays that I have, mixed with the Terra Rosa and Anthracnone Blue that I mentioned earlier, but holy cow does this mixture have some beautiful granulation to it. Sodalite is kind of magical like that, and if you haven't already used it and you do like granulation, I highly recommend it. I'll definitely be looking to use this gray combo in the future. To show off some of the pages in their entirety, I have each swatch page fully intact and finished off with the usual pigment demos at the bottom. These include a wet into wet wash, a glaze, a lifting test, and softening off an edge with water. It's hard to say if the differences here show because the pigments themselves are different, or if it's just the different brands and the different additives that they add to their paints. I didn't have all three colors in one brand, so I did just pick my favorite representatives from each of the color categories. The Sennelier Venetian Red had extremely little flow and really just stayed where you put it. The Da Vinci Indian Red had moderate flow but exhibited hard transitions, and the Winsor Newton Caput Mortuum was prone to cauliflowering. We've reached our final unicorn in the series, and it's a bit bittersweet, but honestly, I couldn't be happier with how she turned out. I had a really hard time deciding which animal to feature because we already painted some of the obvious choices like a fox, which we did in the quinacridone burnt orange episode, and I also recently painted an orangutan with this color as well, so I wasn't going to do a repeat of that. As usual, when I'm stumped, I went to my patrons and asked for some suggestions, and many of them suggested a red squirrel, which I was almost on board with, until one of my other patrons, Lauren, suggested an okapi, and I was immediately sold. I couldn't believe I hadn't thought about it before. I love okapis, and the excuse to do an okapi corn was just too hard to resist. I had the chance to photograph one recently at the St. Louis Zoo, so armed with a bunch of reference photos, I dove in to create this pose and start on my final illustrative piece of the series. I primarily used Indian Red and Caput Mortuum for this piece, so I just want to apologize to Venetian Red itself, as well as my patrons who voted on Venetian Red. I could have still used Venetian Red and added some blue mixed into it, but it was just easier to use the other varieties that I had on hand, so I went with that. I also used neutral tint to deepen some of my tones and yellow ochre on just the horns and a few very light washes on the face to kind of bring in some other color balances. All in all, the vast majority of this piece was just painted with those three tubes, meaning the Indian Red, the Caput Mortuum, and the neutral tint. And I have to say once again how in love I am with the way that the Indian Red looks when it dries. It has such a soft texture to it that even though it loses saturation, which might be frustrating if that's not what you're expecting, I've just come to appreciate it so much that I can't get enough of it. I already have an affinity for red-headed animals, so this is just feeding that, and I might be alone in it. I don't know. You guys let me know below. I had so much fun. I also absolutely love the granulation pattern of the Caput Mortuum and how it intertwines with the softness of the Indian Red to create a really touchable looking fur texture throughout the entire piece. I did find it was really important to make sure that there was a base of that Caput Mortuum in all of my dark colors and adding only enough neutral tint that I needed to get the values that I was looking for. The reason why is that if I used the neutral tint on its own, it felt very cold and disconnected from the other colors in the piece. At the very end of this painting, I added a teeny tiny bit of gouache for some minor highlights on the face, but I used much less of it on this piece than I have in a really long time, and it was pretty refreshing to do so. Well, folks, that is just about going to do it for the Color Spotlight series for now, but it doesn't have to be the end. I've set up a new stretch goal over on Patreon, and when we reach it, there will be a third installment of the series by popular demand. All of my patrons will be voting on those episodes when the time comes, so if you want to help make that happen as well as influence the series itself, we'd love to have you over there on Patreon. I am so deeply grateful for all of my patrons who have been supporting me for the past 2 years. Yes, 2 years, patrons! It is our patron-anniversary. Is that a thing? Patron-anniversary? It's just around the corner, and I have loved every moment of getting a chance to connect with you outside of the YouTube comments. So thank you guys all so much for your support, especially to those of you who have been with me the entire time. In other news, my Etsy shop has been reopened and is fully stocked, full of new prints and zipper pouches for you to snatch up if you would like to do so. And in a couple of weeks, there will be a huge line of new stickers rolling in for some of my more recent works, including some of the unicorns from this here very series, as well as sticker packs for my 100 Animal Eyes Challenge and some Earth Day sticker packs too. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to check out the shop today, or you can also head over to my website at www.denisesoden.com and join my mailing list to be notified when that sticker order rolls in. Thank you guys all so much for waiting patiently for this final episode. I know it was a long overdue. I'm sorry it took so long, but I hope it was worth the wait for, you know, you kind of got a 3 for the price of 1 situation here. You guys know the drill. Let me know in the comments below how you like to use your opaque PR101s in your own works, if you do so. And thank you guys all so much for watching and continuing to support this series. Be sure to subscribe if you are not already and would like to see more watercolor content. And until next time, happy painting.